Salt. This simple crystalline mineral has existed on Earth for billions of years, predating life itself. Occurring naturally in our oceans and underground deposits, salt has played a pivotal role in human civilization. In this documentary, we'll be exploring the history of this life-giving mineral. We'll also be traveling through Africa, Asia, Europe, and America to see how salt is mined and the many different types found in different regions throughout the world. This is the truest example of man's inseparable relationship with nature. It's the story of salt and earth, of salt and life. On the edge of the Dakar Desert in northwestern India is Karagoda village. The people here have been relying on salt to make their living for generations. This old man is Gib Prasad and is the head of his family. In these hard times, he has nowhere else to turn to but the gods. It's the end of May, just before the monsoon season, and massive amounts of precipitation is about to rain down on the land. Soon the desert will become an ocean, and there is a real possibility that every salt field in the vicinity will be destroyed. However, in these snow-white salt dunes, there is still something to be salvaged, but it will take a family effort. They only have a few days. The plan is to load the salt into merchant trucks and sell it in exchange for money. But time is not on their side.
And जो तारीख है छेली लास्ट तारीख आती है इस तारीख के अंदर हम निकाल देते हैं तो उसकी जो बाहर निकाल दिया जो नमक है उसकी जिम्मेदारी खींचने की व्यापारी की होती है समझा कोई आफत और धुआं है बारिश से जो गिर पड़ता है ये जो पिघल जाएगा यानी नहीं खींचेगा तो उसकी जिम्मेदारी व्यापारी की है
Every year from June to October, the Dakar Desert is inundated with water. When the monsoon season ends in October, rainwater evaporates in the sun, and the desert reappears. These are the busiest days of the year. Hundreds of families from nearby villages flock to the desert, carrying tents and other basic living supplies. For the next few months, they will stay here to mine for salt. The Gibb family has been doing this for generations and has always kept to traditional methods. Gibb's eldest son, Dhiran Prasad, is the breadwinner of the family. The first thing he does is plow new furrows in the desert soil and tamps it down beneath his feet. This method ensures the salt will be more pure and unadulterated. The next step is to extract the underground brine to the salt fields. Through the monsoon winds and the light of the sun, the brine naturally evaporates. A high concentration of brine creates larger salt grains, and thus purer crystals are formed.
जो रण में काम करते हैं, ठंडी में काम करते हैं तो पैरों में, हाथों में ठंड लगती है, वो बुखार आ जाती है, वो सर्दन की बीमारी आ जाती है, वो कमर की बीमारी आ जाती है। और जो धूप में काम करता है तो शरीर के सारा जलन होने लगता है।
For these workers, the only chance for respite is just after dusk. At the end of a hard year's work, Gibb's family have harvested a significant amount of salt, but haven't sold as much as other families in their region. According to Gibb, the rainy season is 2 to 3 days away. However, he doesn't have enough manpower to tend to his fields, and there is a real possibility that he won't be able to harvest them in time. If there's too much rain, the salt will decompose and lose its value. The eldest son, Diran, is not shy in voicing his opinion. Because the annual price of salt has remained stagnant, the income from salt production alone is not enough to support their family. His 2 younger brothers are working at salt factories for a higher wage, leaving him and his father the pressure to produce hundreds of tons of salt every year. Diran is trying to persuade his father to hire some seasonal workers. It may cost more, but it seems like the only solution available to them. According to Indian custom, only the father, or head of the family, has the right to make decisions like this. But Gibb is still struggling to make up his mind. The way he sees it, either option poses its own risks. The next morning, Diran comes back from fetching water 30 kilometers away as usual. This time, he finds at least a dozen new hires working in the salt fields. Apparently, Gibb has taken his advice, but he knows just how hard of a decision it was for his father to make. It costs nearly 1/5 of their total income to hire the workers. Except now, all the salt can be harvested in a single day. With the output secured, so is their income. But the gamble hasn't paid off yet, because if there is no rain in the coming months, it will have been an unnecessary expense. Most salt production today has been industrialized and mechanized. But in this remote desert in India, everything is produced by hand. While modern technology and machinery has mostly made their methods obsolete, Gib and the other villagers don't seem to mind the extra work. Gib believes doing everything by hand brings out the best in his salt. And since his methods have been passed down from generation to generation, he feels a deep sense of obligation to do the same with his son. His own grandsons regard the fields as their personal playground, playing in them like children in the snow. This is a happy time for them. They don't have to go to school, and they have plenty of time away from the parents' prying eyes. Gib's daughter-in-law is preparing a traditional lunch of pancakes and curry. They have eaten this dish every day for the last 6 months. Luckily, Gib is able to harvest all of his salt before the rainy season. Although it costs them extra money to hire workers, they increase their yield and now have a little more money to spend.
पहला हम डेढ़ पटा करता था, हम 500 से 550 टन बना सकते थे। अभी 1 साल का 800 टन बना सकते हैं।
कितना पैसा मिलता है?
समझो 800 टन में हमारा गुजरान भी चलता है। बारिश जो गिर पड़ती है तो हमको नुकसान में आ जाता है।
पैसा कितना?
मैंने बारिश नहीं गिरती है, मौसम जो अच्छा रहता है तो 25 से 50 हज़ार रुपया मिल सकता है, इससे ज़्यादा हम नहीं कमा सकते।
Even though their yearly income is settled, Gib still feels at a loss. They've only earned just enough to meet their most basic needs. Like all the salt produced here, Gib's salt will be shipped to the factories and processed into table salt. They've designated a specific spot they believe won't be affected by any possible floods. In a few months, the family will return here and continue their efforts in making what they consider to be the whitest salt in the world, something they have always been deeply proud of. In another part of the world, the descendants of another ancient tribe are also struggling to make their living. We return again to the Lantong River Valley, to the salt fields of Mankong, Tibet. 2,300 meters above sea level. For the last 1,200 years, the Nashi people living on the west bank of Jiada village have been producing pink salt, while the Tibetans on the eastern bank produce the more common white salt. Both tribes' history and hardship with salt is recorded here within these stilted salt plots. Until now, the Nashi people have used the oldest and simplest way of making salt. It has become not just a way of life, but a way to honor their faith. "32-year-old Tsring Yi-chen possesses the most salt plots in Jiada village. After marrying here 10 years ago, this has been her only source of income. Since the men from the village are working in the cities, all the domestic work falls on the women. Because of this, Yi-chen has had to rely on her industriousness to survive. Today, Yi-chen's mother is trying to persuade her to take over 20 more salt plots. Yi-chen already has 30 of her own, so if she agrees, she'll be the busiest woman in the village. Although Yi-chen will see an increase in her income, it won't be much. Luckily, the working conditions are better than those in her mother's time. Back then, they carried the brine from the river to the fields on their backs, which was both painstaking and time-consuming. Today, they use pumps, but that increases the danger of electric shock due to the many electrical wires crisscrossing the fields. Sadly, this is how Yi-chen's best friend died. The more salt plots she takes on, the greater risk she puts on herself. Another reason that gives Yi-chen pause in that a recent boom in tourism has started to have a negative effect on salt production. Some of her friends have their plots built on the steeper side of the mountain, so whenever the opportunity arises to engage in less demanding work, they jump at the chance. In fact, her good friend Roma has even opened up her own noodle restaurant. According to the locals, Jia noodles are so good that you can't just have one bowl. As each bowl has just a few noodles, Droma has created a competition to see who can eat the most bowls of noodles.
点，虽然活的话是干得苦一点，但是还可以赚点钱。
After the visitors finish their meals, they almost always take home a bag of salt. At least here, business is flourishing.
这是白盐是吗？
啊，对，
这个就是你们当地的这个产的红
对
盐啊。
对对，红盐、白盐，这个叫桃花盐。
哦，这有什么功效？
这呢是腌肉、腌菜、泡脚，有脚气和那个脚出汗的，这个特别有功效。
Tourists have been coming from further and further away to visit this remote town, and Heijing is not surprised. Aside from the delicious salt, the salt fields offer their own charm. And now with the success of the Noodle restaurant, there are even more reasons to attract people here. If things continue to go well, Heijing has even entertained the idea of opening her own hotel in the future. But for now, her only focus is providing a comfortable living for her two daughters.
最主要的一个，你看是有个什么来着呢？在这里呢，谁知道不？立刻干嘛？用功个米嘛，那什么我当不，危险什么我，啥抽着的菜里都没有的，从那个这个出说的有个什么来着？
No matter how busy or tired, Heijing always dresses up for the village's weekly dance party. This is the perfect time for the women of the village to let loose and reward themselves for their hard work during the week. After a week's consideration, Heijing has finally made up her mind to take charge of 52 salt plots. With her husband's 3 siblings in college and her 2 daughters leaving for school, she'll need all the extra income she can get. "1,200 years ago, Heijing's ancestors struggled to live in this valley. Nowadays, the salt fields teem with tourists, providing new sources of income for their descendants. It's women like Heijing who make this possible. Throughout history, salt production here has had its ups and downs. In her lifetime, Heijing has experienced both, but has never wavered in her duty or loyalty to her people. This is the Dakar Rally. Teams from Paris have traveled thousands of kilometers across the Mediterranean Sea and Sahara Desert to take part in the most famous off-road race in the world. Just on the other side of the dunes is an entirely different world. Here, a pink, oval lake sits conspicuously amongst a lush green forest. This is Lake Redba in Senegal, a phenomenon few people have ever set eyes upon. Its stunning color comes not from the salt crust on its surface, but instead from the algae that grows on the lake bed below. Like the Dead Sea, the salt content is so high that objects will float on the lake's surface. The rare algae growing beneath the water's surface has also been used in many cosmetic products and dietary supplements. On average, the lake is only ever about 1 meter deep. The Lebu people, who've been living near the lake for thousands of years, have their own unique method for gathering salt. The man proudly wearing the number 44 on his jersey is Nahu. He's just 18 years old and is preparing for a long day's work. Before setting out to work, he carefully covers the sores on his skin with plastic bags and then applies a special ointment to the other sensitive parts of his body. This is the cheapest and most effective way to protect himself. He'll need it because he's about to enter one of the most highly concentrated salt lakes on Earth. Each of the boats lined up along the shore is engraved with their owners' names. But Nahu is a simple man. All he needs is something that floats, a trusty spear, and a few baskets for collecting his salt. Nahu's friends have already set to work. They mark their areas by jabbing long sticks into the lake bottom. Because they're unable to see beneath the surface, they have to break up the salt crust using nothing but feel and experience. Sometimes, almost their entire body is submerged in the water. While the financial cost of salt mining is next to nothing, being immersed in the acidic salt water for long periods of time takes its own toll. Even though Nahu has done his best to slather himself with protective oil, parts of his body are still susceptible to the corrosive waters. Aside from the damage to his skin, working in water like this will render miners like Nahu sterile. Salt mining has been in the Lebu people's genes for as long as anyone can remember. As in most places, the men are responsible for the mining, and the women are tasked with carrying it. But the harsh working conditions are slowly driving people to find other means of work. Amy's husband is one of those people. At 40 years old, she is the head of the female salt workers in charge of transporting salt. As a boat laden with salt pulls into the shore, Amy and her companions wait patiently in good spirits, buckets in hand. It will take several trips to transport the hundreds of kilograms of salt back and forth from the boat to the fields. They use seashells to keep track of each load they carry and receive their wages based on how many they've accumulated at the end of the day. On most days, these women work from dawn till dusk. They are highly respected in their community. When it comes to salt mining in places like this, it's the women who shoulder the burden, oftentimes in the most literal sense. But they've always maintained a positive attitude towards their work, which is perhaps how it should be. After removing small pebbles, filtering out the sand, adding iodine, and drying it for a few hours in the sun, the salt turns a snow-white color. In just half a day, it's ready to be shipped and sold in domestic markets. Senegal is the biggest salt-producing country in West Africa, and almost a third of its output is processed by hand. The Lebu people only mine salt from Lake Redba from November to early summer the following year. For the rest of the year, they will either find part-time work or take some well-deserved time off. Although salt mining here is not exactly a lucrative venture, they make enough money to get by and find few reasons to complain. After all, they've been relying on the rosy pink waters of Lake Redba, just as they have the life-giving blood that runs through their veins. Aside from being one of Yunnan province's major salt-producing hubs, Heijing town of Lufeng County has become a popular place for people to gather on weekends. Here a slight haze from the boiling salt vats can be seen overhanging the town. In the northern part of town, a single workshop that uses ancient salt-making techniques is still in operation. In the past, it was the center of salt production from the Ming Dynasty to the 1940s. Giant water wheels, salt drying platforms, and brine boiling workshops have been kept in working condition for everyone to see how salt was produced in olden times. It's the town's most famous tourist attraction. One popular activity is carving characters into a block of salt and then roasting it over the fire to harden. Once the salt has dried and stiffened, the salt brick is wrapped in red silk and given an official red stamp. This practice dates back to the late Qing dynasty and was used when salt was produced for the government. Heijing's most historical building is its memorial archway, inscribed by the Emperor Guangxi of the Qing dynasty. The arch was erected to honor some chaste widows in the town. However, the stereotype that these women were just meek housewives is far from the truth. At that time, making salt was regarded as a man's job. It was they who toiled day and night in the workshops, stirring the brine and adding wood to the stove. It's highly physical work, though it isn't exactly suitable for women. Heijing town was an essential checkpoint along the ancient T-Horse Road. But while the men were away transporting their goods, their wives were left to take care of their families by themselves, often without ample food and supplies. These stories are not so far in the past as one may think. Many of the elder people living on the street used to be salt makers in their youth. Yong Chung Jen is one of them and is the oldest woman in Heijing. Since her husband died when she was young, she had to smuggle salt to support her and her son. Not surprisingly, she's a little reluctant to tell her story to strangers. "80-year-old He Pi Zhou also grew up in a family of salt workers. His stories go back as far as 60 years, and many of them are still fresh in his memory. With their husbands away for months at a time, women were often left to fend for themselves. Facing starvation, many women turned to smuggling salt just to survive. In old Heijing, the Wuma Bridge was the only way in and out of town. Getting past the local authorities was tricky business. Once the salt was in the town limits, it was boiled during the day in the workshops. At night, women would quietly do the same in their kitchens, being careful not to raise any unwanted attention. The risk they took for their families was nothing short of heroic, because they knew that not only their own lives were hanging in the balance, their children's were as well. At that time, it was secretly known as lady salt. The brine carriers helped the women make their salt in private. Working together, they often produced more than the government quota, enabling them to sell the leftovers in town for extra money. It soon became the main source of private salt in Heijing. Today, the precious commodity can be sold freely and out in the open, and several stalls can be seen displaying prominently along the streets, selling various crafts and souvenirs made from salt. 100 years ago, this would have been unheard of, since women had to carry out their work secretly inside their homes. For obvious reasons, smuggling salt was almost always done under the cover of night, and oftentimes women had to disguise themselves as pregnant women to get past the guarded checkpoints.
They 把它绑起来，拴起来，衣衫穿起来，那是大肚子婆娘，你去摸那肚子干，你不可能去摸。那些女人嘛都厉害呢，那些小嘎子嘛，以前嘛不值钱嘛，过活了。现在大人们挖那些冰那样嘛，啊还有那10个眼上磨个嘎子给他，一2个嘛磨2个给你。妈，你讲的话打到场几点了？我的真，都是这种啊！我娘说是过关的时候是你呢，男的你别帮忙过关。
One of the smuggling routes was from Heijing to Kunming. To avoid drawing attention to themselves, they had to stay off the main roads, traversing steep mountain passes and raging rivers along the way. At night, they would camp outside, under the elements, rather than take a chance of being questioned in town. Through it all, they risked life and limb, persevering through the toughest conditions for the sake of their loved ones. Fortunately, those days are a thing of the past. Today, it's the men who leave for work, while the women, children, and elders stay at home and tend to their farmland. Despite Yong Chung-jen's reluctance to talk about her past, there are still some things she's willing to share. One of her fondest memories is the salt-braised chicken she ate when she was young, a traditional dish in Heijing. For her 88th birthday, her eldest son, Wu Duo, has come to prepare her favorite meal. Its origin comes from a story of a salt worker who killed one of his employer's hens and hid it in a pile of salt. When he finally took it out and cooked it, he said it was the best chicken he'd ever tasted. Unfortunately, the dish has become a rarity here due to the amount of salt and supplies needed to make it. Luckily, Wu Duo's friend owns a restaurant. He has to braise the chicken in a mountain of salt for nearly 2 hours. The finished product is a chicken that is crispy on the outside and tender in the middle. For Yong Chung-jen, it's like experiencing her childhood all over again. In modern societies, it's understandable that we take salt for granted. After all, it adorns our kitchen tables, pantries, and grocery aisles in superfluous amounts. But too often, we forget about the people who live on the edge of poverty to acquire it for us. These are the men and women we don't see who work in the fields, mines, and oceans to provide us with salt. While the photos themselves can't speak, there are thousands of stories here to be told. This is the concept behind the photography exhibition, Kilometers of Salt, held in the Royal Salt Works at the Arc et Senon, France. Originally a salt treatment plant, the Arc et Senon has now been classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The two exhibitors are a married couple, Catherine from France and Seydo from Senegal.
On est parti voir les travailleurs du sel du lac Rose, donc Redba. Et arrivé sur place, on a eu un coup de cœur. Et on a voulu commencer à faire ce travail sur le sel, qu'on a trouvé que c'était des travailleurs qui travaillaient beaucoup plus durement que tout ce qu'on avait pu voir ailleurs. C'était un choc dans le sens où on n'avait jamais vu des gens qui travaillaient si dur. Mais pourtant, avec le sourire.
5 years ago, they went to Lake Redba in Senegal, Seydo's hometown. Never would they have thought it would be the start of a new life for them. After that, they embarked on a decade-long project photographing people who lived in some of the remotest areas of the world. As you would imagine, during their adventures, they encountered many unexpected surprises.
Donc, on cherchait sur Internet, dans les pays où on voulait aller, où est-ce qu'il y avait des travailleurs du sel. Et il n'y avait jamais d'informations parce que ça n'intéresse pas les gens en général.
While they traveled to the Danakil Depression near the border of Somalia and Ethiopia, they had to pass through an area restricted by the military. To gain entry, they needed permission from the tribes and the protection of the local police. In the heart of the African desert, hotels are non-existent, so the only place to set up camp are in ramshackle huts like this one. Thankfully, the local tribesmen are there to lend a helping hand. Despite the extreme heat and tough living conditions, Catherine and Seydo are still able to get the shots they needed. The third leg of their trip took them to the Sacred Valley of Peru in South America. This ancient salt field has been here since Incan times and is still in use today. The salt workers here are mostly women. Their tanned, weathered faces and charming smiles perfectly reflect the resilience of people accustomed to hardship and surviving with minimal resources. Getting their subjects to pose for the camera did take some convincing, though, for there is a superstition here that if you have your picture taken, your spirit will be snatched away. Fortunately, they were able to find a simple solution to the problem.
Et là, c'est là que cette histoire a commencé. Je dis, je vais voir vite le chauffeur qu'on avait. Je lui dis, est-ce que tu sais où on peut trouver du Coca-Cola? Il me dit, oui, oui, mais il faut faire des kilomètres. Alors on est reparti très loin chercher Coca-Cola, on est revenu. Et là, elle accepte d'être photographiée, mais qu'est-ce qu'elle fait? Au moment de prendre la photo, elle me dit, c'est bon, tu peux la prendre, mais elle se tourne. Et elle est comme ça. Et elle n'a jamais voulu de face. Alors que moi, ma passion, c'est photographier de face les personnes le plus possible, des gros plans.
Catherine and Sado's journey is far from over. In the next 20 years, the couple plans to visit 30 more countries to photograph salt workers. One of the places they are most excited to see is Tibet, China, but they still have a little saving to do.
Du moment que la tradition du sel continue à durer, malheureusement, quand ils seront plus là, je pense que ça risque de s'arrêter, puisque les jeunes, je ne pense pas qu'ils veulent faire ça.
It was an eye-opening experience for the two, and in the end, they got a lot more than just a few photos. As the saying goes, picture says 1,000 words. These people have dedicated their lives to providing the rest of the world with salt and have often suffered great hardship to obtain it. We owe them not only our gratitude, but our respect. They truly are the salt of the earth.